The strangest moment in a man's life, Adrien Whitmore would later realize, is not the moment he loses power, but the moment he realizes power cost him everything that mattered. The ballroom inside the Hudson Meridian Hotel shimmered with soft gold light, the kind of quiet luxury that made every surface glow as if it had been polished by the city itself. Crystal chandeliers hung high above the crowd, their reflections dancing across marble floors and polished glass tables, while the low murmur of conversations blended with the faint clink of champagne flutes. It was the kind of night New York's business elite lived for, a gathering where influence moved quietly between handshakes and carefully measured smiles. At the center of it all stood Adrien Whitmore. At 38, Adrien Whitmore had become one of the most recognizable CEOs in the American tech industry. Founder of Whitmore Dynamics, a company valued in the tens of billions, he had the kind of reputation that filled headlines and boardrooms alike. Tall, composed, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, Adrien stood at the stage beneath the soft spotlight, as if the room itself had been built around him. The applause faded slowly as he stepped closer to the microphone, one hand resting lightly against the podium while the other adjusted the thin, silver watch around his wrist. "Innovation," he began, his voice calm and confident, carrying easily across the ballroom, "is not about technology alone. It's about vision. It's about choosing the future you want before anyone else even sees it." Several hundred guests listened closely, executives, investors, journalists, and political figures who had come to hear the man whose company had reshaped entire industries in less than a decade. A large screen behind him displayed the Whitmore Dynamics logo in clean white letters against a midnight blue background. Adrien had delivered hundreds of speeches like this before. Conferences in San Francisco, investment summits in Chicago, technology panels in Austin. He knew exactly how to hold a room, how to pace his voice, how to guide an audience from curiosity to admiration in under 15 minutes. Control had always been one of his greatest strengths. And tonight was no different. When people talk about leadership, Adrien continued, they often talk about power. But real leadership is about decisions. Hard decisions. The ones that define who you are when everything is on the line. Hey. Few people nodded in agreement, while others raised their phones to record the speech. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a waiter moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses. The orchestra stationed near the far wall sat silent now, their instruments resting as the keynote continued. Adrien paused briefly, letting the silence work in his favor. He had learned long ago that silence, used correctly, carried more weight than words. "Because the truth is," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "success isn't built on comfort. It's built on choices that most people are too afraid to make." The crowd responded with a light ripple of applause. Adrien gave a small nod of acknowledgement and lifted his eyes from the podium to scan the room, a habit he had developed over years of speaking. He liked to look at the faces of the people listening. It reminded him who he was speaking to, and more importantly, who he was speaking for. The room stretched wide beneath the chandeliers, rows of round tables filled with carefully dressed guests, soft candlelight flickering between them. Investors from Boston, venture capital firms from California, a senator from Virginia, a few reporters from major networks seated discreetly near the back. Adrien's gaze moved slowly across the crowd, calm and controlled, until it stopped. For a moment, something in his expression shifted, subtle enough that most of the audience didn't notice. His voice paused in the middle of the sentence forming in his mind. Because near the far entrance of the ballroom, just beneath the warm glow of a chandelier, a small figure had stepped into the room. A boy, maybe 6 years old. The child stood quietly beside a woman, his small hand wrapped around hers as they paused just inside the doorway, while a hotel staff member spoke to them briefly. Nothing about the moment should have been unusual. Families sometimes attended charity galas like this. But Adrien couldn't look away. The boy's dark curls caught the light as he glanced around the room with the quiet curiosity children often carry into unfamiliar places. He wore a small navy jacket and polished shoes, standing straight in a way that felt oddly composed for someone so young. And then the boy turned his head slightly. Adrien felt the breath stall in his chest. Because the child's face looked familiar. Not the kind of familiarity that comes from recognition. Something deeper. Something instinctive. The boy had Adrien's eyes. The same sharp shape, the same quiet intensity that had once appeared in photographs of Adrien as a child growing up in Boston. The same faint dimple on the left side of his cheek when he shifted his mouth slightly, as if he were about to ask a question but hadn't decided whether he should. Adrien's fingers tightened against the edge of the podium. The speech in front of him blurred for a fraction of a second. The ballroom suddenly felt quieter than before, even though nothing around him had changed. People were still watching him, still waiting, still recording. But Adrien's attention had narrowed to that one small figure near the entrance. The boy looked up at the woman beside him, tugging gently on her hand as if asking something softly. And that was when Adrien finally saw her. She stepped forward into the light, calm and composed, guiding the child a few steps further into the ballroom as the staff member nodded and moved away. The years had changed her slightly, but not enough to hide who she was. Her posture was still the same, straight-backed and steady. Her dark curls were pulled neatly over one shoulder, framing a face that carried quiet confidence instead of the uncertainty Adrien remembered from long ago. She wore a simple, deep burgundy dress that reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers with every step she took. And when she lifted her eyes toward the stage, Adrien Whitmore felt the past rush back into the room like a door he had locked years ago, suddenly opening again. Nia Carter. The name moved through his mind before he even realized he had thought it. His former wife. The woman he had once promised a lifetime to before deciding that his future required a different path. The woman he had left behind in the pursuit of power, influence, and a life that eventually made him the man standing on this stage tonight. For a moment, neither of them moved. Adrien stood beneath the spotlight, the most powerful man in the room, frozen mid-sentence. And across the ballroom, Nia Carter stood quietly beside a young boy who looked uncannily like the CEO giving the speech. The audience didn't know it yet. The reporters didn't notice it. But Adrien Whitmore suddenly understood something he had never expected to face again. Some decisions don't stay in the past. Sometimes they walk back into your life, holding your hand and looking exactly like you. Adrien Whitmore had faced hostile boardrooms, aggressive investors, and reporters eager to challenge his decisions. But none of those moments had ever unsettled him the way this one did. For the first time in years, the carefully controlled rhythm of his mind had broken. The words he had been about to say lingered somewhere behind his thoughts, unfinished, irrelevant now. Hundreds of people still watched him from their seats beneath the golden chandeliers, expecting the confident CEO they admired, the man who always seemed 10 steps ahead of every situation. But Adrien Whitmore was no longer looking at them. His eyes remained fixed on the woman standing across the ballroom. Nia Carter had not changed in the ways that mattered. There was still that same quiet steadiness in the way she held herself, the same calm presence that once balanced Adrien during the early years of his career when everything had still been uncertain. She stood beside the boy, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder now, as if reminding him to stay close in a room filled with unfamiliar faces. The child looked around with curiosity, his eyes reflecting the warm glow of the ballroom lights. Adrien felt a strange pull in his chest as he watched the boy tilt his head slightly while studying the enormous chandelier above him. The gesture was small, almost ordinary, but Adrien recognized it immediately. It was a habit he had seen in old photographs of himself as a child, a quiet instinct to observe the world before speaking. The realization sent a subtle tension through his posture. He had not moved from the podium, but something about him had changed. His fingers tightened slightly against the smooth edge of the wood, the polished surface cool beneath his palm. The audience noticed the pause now. A few people exchanged glances while others leaned forward slightly, assuming the silence was part of his presentation. Adrien Whitmore was known for using pauses intentionally, allowing tension to build before delivering a powerful statement. Only he knew that this silence was not intentional. Across the ballroom, Nia met his gaze calmly. There was no surprise in her expression, no visible discomfort. If anything, her composure suggested that she had expected this moment long before stepping into the room. The quiet understanding in her eyes unsettled Adrien more than anger ever could have. Because anger would have been easier to explain. Anger belonged to the past. What Nia carried now looked like certainty. The boy tugged gently at her sleeve, whispering something that Adrien could not hear from the stage. Nia leaned down slightly, listening with a patient smile before answering him in a soft voice. The child nodded, satisfied, and turned his attention back toward the stage, toward Adrien. Their eyes met for the briefest second. Adrien felt the air leave his lungs slowly as the resemblance became impossible to ignore. The shape of the child's eyes, the curve of his brow, even the way he stood with quiet balance instead of restless energy. It was like looking at a reflection from another time. Adrien forced his attention back to the microphone. The crowd still waited. He cleared his throat gently, the sound amplified through the speakers across the ballroom. As I was saying, he continued, his voice steady once again though something inside him had shifted. Every decision a leader makes eventually defines the future that follows. The audience responded with quiet attentiveness, unaware that the words carried a meaning Adrien himself had not fully considered until this exact moment. His gaze drifted across the room once more, though now he avoided looking directly toward the entrance. The speech moved forward automatically, built on years of experience and discipline. Adrien spoke about innovation, long-term investment strategies, and the responsibility that came with guiding a company that employed thousands of people across the country. The words flowed exactly as they always had. But somewhere in the background of his mind, another thought refused to fade. Nia Carter had disappeared 8 years ago. The memory returned slowly, as if someone had opened a locked archive inside his mind. 8 years earlier, the world had looked very different. Whitmore Dynamics had not yet become the giant it was today. Adrien had been ambitious, determined to build something that would secure his place among the most influential leaders in the industry. At the same time, pressure from investors and board members had grown stronger. They wanted expansion, partnerships, alliances that could move the company forward faster. One particular alliance had come with conditions that Adrien had once considered impossible to accept. A merger opportunity with a powerful investment group whose influence reached deep into politics and global markets. The opportunity promised enormous growth for Whitmore Dynamics, but it came with expectations about leadership image, social connections, and long-term positioning within elite business circles. Nia had listened quietly the night Adrien explained the situation to her. They had been standing in their apartment overlooking the East River, the lights of Manhattan glowing through the glass windows behind them. Adrien remembered the way she had rested her hands against the kitchen counter while he spoke about the future with intense focus, outlining everything he believed he needed to do to reach the next level of success. She had not interrupted him. Not once. When he finished explaining the pressures he faced and the expectations others had placed on him, Nia had simply asked one question. And where do I fit into that future? Adrien had not answered right away. The silence between them had stretched longer than either of them expected. It was the first time he realized that the path he had chosen might not include the life they had once planned together. Eventually, he gave her the honest answer he believed she deserved. The decision that followed had been cold, practical, and devastatingly final. Adrien Whitmore chose the future that would make him powerful. The divorce had been quiet and efficient, handled by lawyers who ensured that the separation never became public scandal. Within a year, Adrien's company secured the partnership that accelerated its growth beyond anything he had imagined. And Nia Carter disappeared from his world entirely. Until tonight, the applause of the audience pulled Adrien back into the present moment. He realized his speech had reached its conclusion. The crowd responded warmly, several guests rising slightly from their seats as they clapped. Adrien nodded politely, stepping away from the microphone as the host returned to the stage to thank him for his remarks. But Adrien's attention had already shifted back toward the far side of the ballroom. Nia and the boy had moved further inside now, guided by a hotel staff member toward a table near the edge of the room. The child sat in his chair carefully while Nia adjusted the small napkin beside his plate. The gesture was simple, gentle, practiced. Adrien watched them for a long moment, something unfamiliar settling into his chest as the realization slowly became impossible to ignore. 8 years ago, he had believed that closing one chapter of his life would allow him to build something greater. Standing in the center of the ballroom now, surrounded by wealth, influence, and admiration, Adrien Whitmore suddenly wondered if the most important chapter of his life had never truly closed at all. Adrien Whitmore stepped down from the stage with the practiced composure of a man who had spent more than a decade under public scrutiny. The applause still echoed across the ballroom as he shook the host's hand and exchanged polite smiles with several executives waiting near the front. To everyone watching, he appeared exactly as he always had, controlled, confident, and entirely focused. But the moment the formal greetings ended, his attention drifted again toward the far side of the room. Nia Carter sat at a round table near the edge of the ballroom, the soft candlelight reflecting gently across the glass surface in front of her. The boy sat beside her, swinging his feet slightly above the polished floor while studying the small folded menu placed near his plate. The child's curiosity was quiet rather than restless. He examined each detail carefully, tracing the printed letters with one small finger as if learning something new about the world in front of him. Adrien stood still for a moment near the stage stairs, his eyes fixed on the two figures across the room. 8 years had passed since the last time he had seen Nia Carter in person. 8 years since the quiet meeting in a lawyer's office where they had signed the documents that separated their lives permanently. At least that was what Adrien had believed at the time. A few guests approached him again, congratulating him on the speech. Adrien nodded politely, responding with the kind of brief comments that had become second nature to him over the years. But his focus kept drifting back to the boy. The resemblance was no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence. The child laughed softly at something Nia said to him, and for a second Adrien saw a familiar expression appear on the boy's face. The same quick spark in the eyes. The same thoughtful pause before responding. Adrien had seen that expression countless times in old photographs from his childhood home in Boston. The recognition settled deeper in his mind with every passing second. Finally, Adrien stepped away from the group of investors surrounding him and began walking across the ballroom floor. The polished marble reflected the warm light above him as he moved through clusters of guests engaged in quiet conversation. Some people nodded respectfully as he passed, while others paused their conversations entirely, assuming the CEO was simply greeting more attendees. Adrien barely noticed them. Each step toward the far side of the room felt strangely deliberate, as if he were approaching something he had unknowingly avoided for years. At the table near the edge of the ballroom, Nia had already noticed him coming. Her posture remained calm, her expression composed, though her eyes followed Adrien's approach with quiet awareness. She had always been observant. That was something Adrien remembered clearly. Long before Whitmore Dynamics became a global company, when Adrien was still working endless nights to prove himself, Nia had been the one person who could read his thoughts before he spoke them. The boy looked up as Adrien stopped beside the table. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. The child's dark curls framed a face that carried subtle features Adrien recognized instinctively. The boy tilted his head slightly, studying Adrien with the polite curiosity children often show toward unfamiliar adults. Adrien realized the child was waiting for him to speak. For a brief moment, the words refused to come. Nia broke the silence first. "Hello, Adrien." Her voice carried the same calm tone he remembered, steady and controlled, without hostility or warmth. It was simply acknowledgement. Adrien nodded slowly. Nia. The single word felt heavier than he expected. 8 years condensed into one quiet exchange. The boy glanced between them, sensing that the two adults knew each other. "Mom," he asked softly, "who is he?" The word struck Adrien with unexpected force. Mom. The sound of it confirmed something that had already begun forming in his mind. Nia rested her hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Micah," she said calmly. "This is Adrien Whitmore." The boy's eyes widened slightly with recognition. Even children understood that name. The face of Adrien Whitmore had appeared in countless news segments and magazine covers over the years. "The technology guy?" Micah asked. Adrien felt a faint smile appear despite the tension in his chest. "Something like that," he said. Micah studied him thoughtfully for another moment, clearly deciding whether this conversation was interesting enough to continue. After a few seconds, he returned his attention to the small dessert plate in front of him, apparently satisfied with the explanation. Adrien's eyes lifted toward Nia again. Up close, he could see the subtle changes time had brought to her face. The softness of youth had been replaced with a quiet strength that seemed even more defined now. She looked composed, grounded, as if the years had shaped her into someone entirely comfortable with the life she had built. "I did not expect to see you here tonight," Adrien said carefully. Nia tilted her head slightly, considering the words. This event supports several education programs, she replied. The foundation I work with was invited. Adrien absorbed that information silently. Of course Nia would be involved in something like that. Even during the early years of their relationship, she had always been drawn toward work that focused on helping others build better futures. It had been one of the things Adrien admired most about her. His gaze drifted again toward Micah. The boy had picked up a small spoon and was examining it with deep concentration before taking another bite of the chocolate dessert in front of him. Adrien noticed the way he held the spoon carefully, balancing it with quiet precision instead of rushing. The habit felt oddly familiar. Adrien exhaled slowly. The question had been building in his mind from the moment he first saw the child near the ballroom entrance. Every logical explanation he tried to construct had collapsed under the weight of what his instincts were telling him. Finally, he looked back at Nia. How old is he? The question was simple, but both of them understood its meaning. Nia did not answer immediately. She watched Adrien for a moment, her eyes calm but deliberate, as if measuring the weight of the conversation before allowing it to continue. Then she spoke. 7, she said quietly. Adrien felt the number settle into place with unsettling precision. 7 years. The timeline aligned perfectly with the final months of their marriage. For a moment, the ballroom noise faded into the background of Adrien's awareness. The laughter of nearby guests, the distant music beginning again near the orchestra stage, the soft clinking of glasses at neighboring tables. None of it seemed to matter. Adrien looked at Micah again. The boy glanced up at that exact moment, meeting Adrien's gaze with open curiosity. There was no suspicion in his expression, no awareness of the tension between the adults around him. Just the quiet, steady look of a child trying to understand the world. Adrien felt something shift inside him, something unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. Because in that moment he realized that the future he had once chosen so confidently might not have erased the past the way he believed. Some truths did not disappear simply because a person decided to walk away from them. Sometimes they grew quietly, patiently, until the day they stood directly in front of you. Adrien Whitmore did not move for several seconds after hearing the answer. 7. The number lingered in the quiet space between them like a door that had just opened into a room he had never expected to enter. Around them the ballroom continued with its gentle rhythm of conversation, music, and polished laughter, but Adrien felt strangely separated from it all now, as if the world had shifted slightly out of alignment. His eyes returned to the boy sitting beside Nia. Micah had finished his dessert and now rested his elbows carefully near the edge of the table while studying the centerpiece candle with quiet fascination. The small flame reflected in his dark eyes, dancing gently with every subtle movement of air in the room. Adrien noticed the way the boy leaned forward slightly, thoughtful and observant, exactly the way Adrien himself had once done when he was a child trying to understand something new. The resemblance was no longer subtle. Adrien exhaled slowly and lifted his gaze back to Nia. 7, he repeated softly, as if confirming the number again might somehow change what it meant. Nia gave a small nod. There was no tension in her expression, no urgency to explain or defend anything. She sat comfortably in her chair, her hands resting calmly on the table as if this moment had been part of a timeline she had already accepted long ago. Adrien studied her carefully, searching for some sign of resentment or bitterness. Instead, he saw something else entirely. Peace. That realization unsettled him more than anger would have. You never told me, Adrien said quietly. The words were not an accusation. They were closer to a realization spoken out loud. Nia's eyes held his for a moment before she answered. You did. Not ask. The simplicity of the response landed with quiet precision. Adrien opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. The truth of her statement was impossible to ignore. 8 years ago, he had closed the door on their marriage with complete certainty that the decision was necessary for the future he intended to build. Once the legal process ended, he had never tried to contact her again. He had assumed their lives would move forward separately, permanently. Micah looked up again, noticing the adults had grown quiet. Mom, he asked, are we staying here long? Nia glanced toward him with a gentle smile. Just a little while longer, she said. Then we will head home. The boy nodded, satisfied with the answer, and began examining the folded event program that had been placed at their table earlier in the evening. Adrien watched the interaction carefully. The natural ease between them revealed something unmistakable. Nia had built a life that revolved around this child. Every movement, every quiet response she gave him carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years guiding and protecting another human being through the world. Adrien felt a strange weight settle in his chest as he realized how many of those years had passed without his knowledge. 7 birthdays. 7 years of first days at school, small achievements, quiet conversations before bedtime. All the moments that formed the foundation of a child's life had unfolded somewhere far beyond Adrien Whitmore's awareness. The realization did not arrive with dramatic force. Instead, it settled slowly, like a quiet understanding spreading through his thoughts. Adrien had spent the last decade building one of the most successful technology companies in the country. His name appeared regularly on lists of influential leaders and innovative entrepreneurs. But standing beside this table now, watching a young boy who carried his features examine a printed program with serious concentration, Adrien felt something unfamiliar pressing against the edges of his carefully constructed world. "Why tonight?" he asked after a moment. Nia looked at him with mild curiosity. "What do you mean?" Adrien gestured gently toward the ballroom around them. "Of all the events in this city, why come to one where you knew I would be speaking?" Nia considered the question calmly. "Because the foundation I work with supports education programs for children who do not have access to strong resources in their communities," she explained. "This event raises funding for several of those programs." She paused briefly, her expression steady. "And because I do not build my life around avoiding places where you might be." Adrien absorbed that quietly. The honesty in her voice carried no hostility, only clarity. She had moved forward with her life without shaping it around the past they once shared. That realization added another layer to the growing weight inside him. Micah suddenly looked up again, glancing between them with interest. "Did you two know each other before tonight?" he asked. Adrien hesitated for a fraction of a second. Nia answered gently. "Yes, we did." The boy's eyes brightened with curiosity. "From work?" Nia smiled slightly. "From a long time ago." Micah seemed satisfied with that explanation. He returned to examining the printed pages in his hands, occasionally glancing up at the chandeliers as if measuring the height of the ceiling above them. Adrien studied him again, noticing small details he had missed before. The boy's posture was naturally balanced, confident without being loud. His movements were thoughtful, careful rather than impulsive. There was a quiet intelligence in the way he observed the room before reacting to it. Adrien recognized those traits with unsettling familiarity. "He seems very thoughtful," Adrien said quietly. Nia followed his gaze toward Micah. A hint of warmth appeared in her expression. "He likes to understand things before speaking about them," she said. Adrien almost smiled at the description. It was exactly the way his teachers had once described him during elementary school. Another piece of the realization settled into place. The orchestra across the ballroom began playing softly again, the gentle sound of violins filling the air while waiters moved between tables with fresh trays of drinks. The event continued with its usual rhythm, unaware that something far more personal had begun unfolding quietly at one small table near the edge of the room. Adrien straightened slightly, aware that several guests had started watching their conversation with mild curiosity. He lowered his voice just enough to keep the conversation private. "Does he know?" he asked carefully. Nia understood the meaning immediately. She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "Not yet." Adrien nodded once, absorbing the answer. For a moment neither of them spoke again. Micah looked up one more time, catching Adrien's gaze with open curiosity. Adrien realized that the child was trying to understand why this unfamiliar man had suddenly appeared at their table and begun speaking quietly with his mother. Adrien felt the strange weight in his chest deepen as he met the boy's eyes again. Because for the first time since he had built his empire, Adrien Whitmore found himself facing a question far more complicated than any business decision he had ever made. Not a question about profit or influence. A question about responsibility, time, and the life that had continued growing quietly while he was busy building something else. Adrien Whitmore remained beside the table longer than he expected, aware that every second made the moment more real. The orchestra continued its soft performance across the ballroom, while conversations resumed around them. but Adrienne's attention had narrowed completely to the small world formed by the three people standing at this table. Micah had now finished examining the program and had begun quietly stacking the small dessert plates and utensils in front of him, carefully aligning them as if organizing a tiny construction project. The precision of the movement caught Adrienne's attention. The boy placed each item deliberately, adjusting the edges until everything lined up perfectly. Adrienne remembered doing the exact same thing with toy blocks when he was 7 years old, building towers on the living room carpet while his mother watched from the kitchen. The memory arrived without warning, vivid and unsettling. Adrienne looked away briefly, letting the sound of the violin drift through the air while he tried to steady the thoughts forming in his mind. Nia noticed the shift in his expression. She had always been able to read the quiet signals Adrienne tried to hide from others. "You do not have to stay," she said calmly. "We did not come here to disrupt your evening." Adrien shook his head slightly. "You are not disrupting anything." He paused, searching for the right words. "This is simply unexpected." Nia accepted the explanation with a small nod. "Life tends to be like that." Adrienne looked at Micah again. The boy had finished organizing the table and now rested his chin in his hand while watching a waiter carry a tray of sparkling drinks through the crowd. There was a thoughtful calmness about him that stood in contrast to the busy movement of the ballroom. Adrienne realized something else at that moment. Micah had not once interrupted the conversation between the adults or demanded attention the way many children might in a room full of strangers. Instead, he listened, observed, and waited patiently for the world around him to make sense. That quiet maturity stirred something deeper inside Adrienne. "What school does he go to?" Adrienne asked carefully. Nia answered without hesitation. "Riverside Academy." Adrienne recognized the name immediately. Riverside Academy was one of the most respected preparatory schools in the city, known for its emphasis on independent thinking and leadership development. "He must enjoy it," Adrienne said. Nia's expression softened slightly. "He does, especially science and engineering." Adrienne felt a faint, almost ironic smile appear. "Engineering." Nia noticed the reaction. "He likes to build things," she continued. "Last month he designed a small solar-powered car for a school project." Adrienne glanced at Micah again with renewed interest. The boy had now spotted the large digital display screen mounted near the stage and was studying the shifting graphics with focused attention. "Did it work?" Adrienne asked quietly. Nia nodded. It traveled about 12 feet across the classroom floor before stopping. Adrienne let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh. 12 feet. When he was a child, his first mechanical project had been a small motorized cart that rolled about 10 feet before the wheels jammed. The similarity was almost impossible to ignore. The past seemed to echo through the present in ways Adrienne had never anticipated. A waiter approached the table and placed fresh glasses of water in front of the guests. Micah looked up politely and said thank you before returning to his quiet observation of the room. Adrienne noticed the simple courtesy immediately. "He is very polite," Adrienne said. Nia smiled slightly. "I remind him that respect travels further than impatience." Adrienne nodded slowly, recognizing the familiar lesson. His mother had once said the exact same thing to him when he was young. The realization deepened the strange sense of connection he felt standing here. For several seconds, none of them spoke again. Adrienne could feel the weight of everything that had been left unsaid hovering just beneath the surface of the conversation. The truth had not been spoken directly yet, but it was present in every glance between them. Finally, Adrien leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so the surrounding guests could not hear. "Does he know my name?" he asked. Nia looked at him thoughtfully before answering. "He knows who you are." Adrien felt his chest tighten slightly. "From the news?" "From the world around him," Nia said. "Your company appears in technology programs, school discussions, magazines. It is difficult to avoid the name Whitmore." Adrien nodded slowly. That made sense. Whitmore Dynamics had become a dominant force in the industry, shaping the way technology companies approached innovation. The name carried influence everywhere. What Adrien had not considered until tonight was the possibility that the name might appear in his own child's world without his knowledge. Micah suddenly turned toward Adrien again, curiosity lighting his face. "Do you really build robots?" he asked. Adrien blinked in mild surprise before answering. "Sometimes." Micah leaned forward slightly, clearly intrigued now. My teacher says robots might help people do dangerous jobs someday. Adrien smiled faintly at the thoughtful statement. Your teacher is correct, he said. Machines can help humans solve problems that would otherwise be very difficult. Micah nodded slowly, processing the idea with quiet seriousness. That sounds important, he said. Adrien felt something unexpected shift in his chest again. The boy's simple observation carried more sincerity than most of the praise Adrien received from business partners and investors. Nia watched the interaction carefully, her eyes calm but attentive. She had always believed that character revealed itself through small moments rather than dramatic declarations. The way Adrien responded to Micah now told her more about him than any speech he had delivered earlier that evening. Adrien glanced at her briefly, aware that she was observing the conversation closely. He asks good questions, Adrien said. Nia nodded. He likes to understand how things work. Adrien looked back at Micah again. The boy had returned to watching the ballroom with thoughtful interest, completely unaware that the quiet conversation unfolding around him might reshape his life in ways he could not yet imagine. Adrien realized something then that he had not allowed himself to consider before. The life he had built during the past 8 years had been defined by ambition, discipline, and calculated decisions. Every major step had been designed to move Whitmore Dynamics toward greater success. Yet standing here now, looking at the young boy whose curiosity mirrored his own childhood, Adrien felt the unsettling awareness that one of the most important chapters of his life had been written entirely without him. Knowing it existed, Adrien Whitmore remained standing beside the table longer than he realized, watching Micah with the quiet attention of someone trying to solve a problem that could not be analyzed with charts or numbers. The ballroom continued moving around them in elegant rhythms, waiters weaving through clusters of guests, soft laughter rising beneath the glow of chandeliers, and the orchestra playing a gentle arrangement that drifted through the air like a calm tide. Yet Adrien felt strangely detached from the room now, as if everything beyond this small table had faded into the background. Micah had found a folded brochure about the Education Foundation and was slowly reading it line by line. Every so often he looked up at the ballroom and then back down again, as if trying to connect what he saw on the page with the real world around him. Adrien noticed the way the boy mouthed certain words quietly while reading, testing their sound before continuing. It reminded him of something his mother once told him when he was learning new vocabulary as a child. Understanding begins when you slow down enough to listen to your own thoughts. Adrien had carried that lesson into his entire career without ever realizing how deeply it had shaped him. And now he was watching the same instinct appear in a child who might very well carry his blood. Adrien shifted his weight slightly, aware that standing beside the table this long was drawing occasional glances from nearby guests. Some of them recognized him immediately and looked curious about the quiet conversation unfolding here. Nia seemed to notice the attention as well. She leaned slightly toward Adrien and spoke in a calm voice that remained almost private beneath the music. You should probably return to your guests, she said gently. People are watching. Adrien glanced briefly across the ballroom. A group of investors stood near the stage speaking with the event host while several reporters adjusted their cameras. It was true that his presence carried expectations in rooms like this. Normally, he moved through events with careful precision, greeting partners, acknowledging supporters, and maintaining the image of a leader who was always in control. But tonight the routine felt strangely distant. Adrien looked back at Micah again. The boy had now reached the final page of the brochure and carefully folded it again along the original creases before, setting it back on the table. The movement was precise, deliberate. Adrien realized something then that surprised him. He did not want to walk away yet. I will return in a moment, Adrien said quietly to Nia, though he remained standing where he was. Nia studied him for a second before nodding once. She had always been perceptive enough to recognize when Adrien was trying to process something important. Micah looked up again, noticing Adrien was still there. Do you go to a lot of events like this? He asked curiously. Adrien smiled faintly. More than I probably should. Micah considered that answer with serious thought. It looks very busy, he said. Adrien nodded. It can be. Micah glanced around the ballroom again. My school had a science fair last month, he continued. There were a lot of people there too, but not this many. Adrien crouched slightly so that he was closer to Micah's height, a gesture that surprised even himself. What project did you present? Micah's eyes brightened immediately. The solar car I told you about, he said. My teacher helped me connect the panels to a small battery so the wheels could keep moving even when the sunlight changed. Adrien listened carefully. The explanation was simple but clear, delivered with the quiet excitement of someone discovering how the world works piece by piece. Adrien realized something else at that moment. Micah did not speak like a child trying to impress an adult. He spoke like a young thinker describing an idea that genuinely fascinated him. That sounds like a very thoughtful design, Adrien said. Micah nodded with satisfaction. It moved 12 feet, he said again proudly. Adrien allowed himself a small laugh. 12 feet is a strong start. Nia watched the exchange silently, her expression calm but thoughtful. She had seen many sides of Adrien during the years they spent together, the ambitious entrepreneur, the determined strategist, the man who refused to accept limits when building his company. But she had rarely seen this version of him. The version who crouched beside a child to listen carefully to a small engineering project. Micah suddenly tilted his head slightly while studying Adrien's face. You look a little like me, he said matter-of-factly. Adrien felt the words settle heavily in his chest. The observation was innocent, delivered with the simple honesty children often carry before the world. Teaches them to soften their thoughts. Nia's eyes shifted briefly toward Adrien, watching his reaction closely. Adrien held Micah's gaze for a moment before answering calmly. Sometimes people share similar features, he said gently. Micah seemed satisfied with that explanation. He returned his attention to the candle centerpiece again, watching the small flame flicker as the air moved through the room. Adrien straightened slowly. The moment had passed quietly, but the meaning behind it lingered strongly in his thoughts. The orchestra finished one song and began another, the soft piano notes spreading through the ballroom like a quiet wave. Across the room, Adrien could see several executives from Whitmore Dynamics beginning to search for him among the guests. His presence was expected at their tables soon. Nia noticed it as well. You really should go, she said quietly. Adrien hesitated for a brief second before nodding. I will. He paused again, looking down at Micah one more time. The boy was still studying the candle flame with careful curiosity, completely unaware of how much his presence had altered the course of Adrien Whitmore's evening. Adrien realized that in the world of business, every major decision came with clear calculations. Profit, risk, timing, and long-term strategy. But standing here now, looking at the quiet intelligence in the eyes of a 7-year-old boy who might be his son, Adrien Whitmore understood that some questions could not be solved with logic alone. And for the first time in many years, the future he had built so carefully no longer felt as certain as it once did. Adrien Whitmore finally stepped away from the table, though each step across the ballroom felt slower than usual, as if part of him remained behind with the quiet 7-year-old boy watching a candle flame flicker in a glass holder. The soft music from the orchestra continued to flow through the room, while conversations resumed around the tables. From the outside, nothing had changed. The elegant gala still moved with the same polished rhythm that defined gatherings of powerful people. But inside Adrien's mind, the evening had shifted in a way he could not easily explain. As he moved back toward the center of the ballroom, several executives from Whitmore Dynamics greeted him with relieved smiles. They had been waiting for him near a high table beside the stage where a small group of investors had gathered. Adrien, one of them said warmly, extending his hand. That speech was excellent. Several people from the Boston Investment Group want to speak with you before the next presentation. Adrien shook the man's hand automatically, offering the calm nod that years of leadership had trained into him. Of course, he said. But even as he spoke, his attention drifted back across the room. From this distance, he could still see the table near the edge of the ballroom where Nia and Micah sat. The boy was now leaning slightly closer to his mother while she quietly explained something from the event program. Adrien could not hear their words from here, but the small interaction carried the natural warmth of a relationship built over years. It was the kind of moment most people would overlook in a crowded room. Yet Adrien found it impossible to ignore. Adrien, the voice of his chief financial officer, pulled him back into the conversation. The Chicago partners want to discuss expansion into the robotics sector. They believe the timing is right. Adrien turned his attention back to the group of executives standing around him. Normally, he would have engaged immediately, asking questions, outlining possibilities, shaping the conversation toward the strategic outcomes he preferred. That had always been one of his greatest strengths as a leader. But tonight his responses felt slower, as if part of his mind was still working through something far more personal than corporate growth plans. "We will schedule a meeting tomorrow morning," Adrien said after a moment. "There are details that need to be examined carefully before we move forward." The executives nodded in agreement, satisfied with the answer. One of them began describing the potential market opportunities, while another mentioned new developments from their research team. Adrien listened politely, maintaining the professional composure expected from the head of a global technology company. Yet behind the steady expression on his face, his thoughts continued drifting back to the table near the edge of the ballroom. 7 years. The number repeated itself quietly in his mind like a clock marking time he had never seen passing. During those 7 years, Adrien Whitmore had transformed Whitmore Dynamics into one of the most influential technology companies in the country. The company's innovations had reshaped entire industries. His leadership had earned recognition in business magazines, financial networks, and international conferences. Investors trusted his judgment. Competitors studied his strategies. Yet none of that success had prepared him for the simple reality, now sitting quietly across the room with a curious expression and dark curls catching the chandelier light. A boy who had his eyes. Adrien, the host of the event, approached the group with a welcoming smile. "Several donors would like to meet you before the final presentation begins." Adrien nodded politely. "Of course." The host guided him toward another section of the ballroom, where several prominent guests stood waiting. Handshakes followed, along with polite introductions and brief conversations about technology, education, and future partnerships. Adrien answered each question with the calm clarity that had made him a respected voice in the industry. To everyone around him, the evening continued exactly as expected. But every few minutes Adrien's gaze returned to the same table. At one point he saw Micah stand from his chair and walk with Nia toward a display near the wall that showed photographs of the Foundation's education programs. The boy examined the pictures with careful interest while Nia pointed out different projects being supported by the event. Adrien watched the interaction quietly from across the room. There was a quiet pride in the way she spoke to the child, a calm confidence in her gestures. Nia had always believed in building things that lasted. When they were younger, she had often spoken about education as the most powerful investment a society could make. Adrien remembered long evenings when they discussed ideas about the future, sitting near the window of their apartment while the lights of the city stretched endlessly below them. Back then the future had seemed simple. They had believed it was something they would build together. Adrien felt the memory settle heavily in his thoughts. A voice beside him interrupted the moment. "You seem distracted tonight." Adrien turned slightly and saw one of the senior investors studying him with mild curiosity. The man smiled politely. "Is everything all right?" Adrien gave a controlled nod. "Just thinking." The investor chuckled lightly. "That usually means you are planning something." Adrien offered a faint smile, but did not answer. Because for the first time in many years, the thoughts occupying his mind were not about strategy or innovation. They were about time, about choices, about the quiet possibility that the life he had carefully constructed might have left something important behind without his realizing it. Across the ballroom, Micah looked up suddenly and caught Adrien watching him again. The boy raised his hand in a small, polite wave. Adrien hesitated only a second before returning the gesture. The simple exchange lasted less than a moment, but something about it settled deeper inside Adrien than any business deal he had ever negotiated. And as the orchestra began playing another soft melody beneath the glow of the chandeliers, Adrien Whitmore realized that the most important conversation of his evening had not yet begun. The music inside the ballroom shifted into a slower melody as the orchestra began another arrangement, the soft sound of piano and strings spreading through the air like a calm tide. Adrien Whitmore remained standing near the center of the room with a glass of water in his hand, speaking politely with two donors who had approached him moments earlier. They were discussing future funding for educational robotics programs, a subject Adrien would normally explore with careful enthusiasm. Yet even as he answered their questions with measured confidence, his attention drifted again toward the far side of the ballroom. Nia and Micah had returned to their table. The boy now held a small tablet device that had been set beside the event materials, studying a digital presentation about student engineering projects supported by the foundation. Adrien watched the way Micah leaned slightly closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing with concentration as he examined the images. Every so often the boy glanced up at the real world around him, comparing what he saw on the display to the room filled with people who were helping make those programs possible. Adrien felt a strange mixture of curiosity and something deeper he had not yet named. When the conversation with the donors finally ended, Adrien excused himself politely and walked toward the balcony doors near the back of the ballroom. The tall glass panels opened quietly as he stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the river. The cool night air brushed against his face, carrying the distant sound of traffic moving through the city streets below. For the first time since the evening began, Adrien allowed himself a moment without the expectations of the crowd around him. The lights of Manhattan stretched across the water in endless reflections, a familiar skyline that had once symbolized everything he hoped to achieve. Adrien rested his hands lightly against the railing and let his thoughts settle. 7 years. During those years he had rarely looked back at the life he left behind. The decision had been clear at the time, driven by ambition and the belief that success required sacrifices others might not understand. Whitmore Dynamics had grown faster than anyone predicted. Investors praised his leadership. Analysts studied his strategies. Yet standing on the quiet balcony now, Adrien realized that none of those achievements answered the question that had followed him out here into the night. What kind of future had he actually built? The glass door behind him opened again with a soft sound. Adrien turned slightly and saw Nia step onto the terrace. She closed the door gently behind her, leaving the music and conversation of the ballroom muted inside. For a moment neither of them spoke. The river moved slowly beneath the city lights while a cool breeze lifted the edge of Nia's dark hair. She walked toward the railing and stood a few feet away from Adrien, her posture calm and steady. "You always liked this view," she said quietly. Adrien nodded once. "It reminds me that the world is bigger than whatever problem we are dealing with." Nia glanced out across the water. "You said that the first night we came to New York together." Adrien remembered the moment clearly. They had stood on a rooftop years earlier, watching the same skyline while talking about the future with the optimism of two people who believed anything was possible. The memory lingered between them like a photograph from another life. After a moment, Adrien spoke again. "Why did you not tell me?" The question was gentle but direct. Nia understood immediately what he meant. She folded her arms lightly against the railing and looked out across the river before answering. "Because the life you chose did not leave space for the truth." Adrien absorbed the words slowly. They were not spoken with accusation or anger. They were simply the explanation she had already accepted years ago. "You made it clear that your future required different priorities," she continued. "When I realized I was pregnant, I understood that the child deserved a life built on stability, not uncertainty." Adrien felt the weight of her words settle deeper into his thoughts. "You believed I would see him as a complication." Nia turned slightly toward him. "I believed you had already decided what mattered most to you." The honesty in her voice carried a quiet finality. Adrien looked down at the river again, watching the lights ripple across the surface of the water. "And you built a life without me," he said softly. Nia nodded once. "Yes." Adrien closed his eyes briefly, processing the simplicity of that answer. Across the years he had imagined many possible paths his life might follow. But none of those scenarios had included discovering that a child carrying his name had grown up just miles away without his knowledge. "He is a remarkable boy," Adrien said after a moment. Nia's expression softened slightly. "He is curious about everything." Adrien allowed a faint smile. "That much is clear." Another quiet pause settled between them while the city lights reflected in the glass behind them. Finally Adrien spoke again, his voice lower now. "Does he deserve to know the truth?" Nia looked toward the balcony door that led back into the ballroom, where Micah remained inside. "One day he will," she said. "But I wanted him to grow into himself before the world around him complicated things." Adrien nodded slowly. That explanation made sense in a way that felt both logical and deeply personal. Nia had always believed that children needed time to discover who they were before the weight of adult decisions shaped their identity. Adrien looked toward the glass doors again. Through the reflection, he could see Micah inside the ballroom, standing near the table while examining a small model robot displayed by the Foundation's science program. The boy moved carefully around the display, studying the mechanical parts with thoughtful interest. Adrien felt something shift again inside his chest as he watched the child's quiet curiosity. For years, Adrien Whitmore had believed that success meant building something powerful enough to shape the future of technology. But standing on the balcony now, watching a 7-year-old boy discover how machines worked with patient fascination, Adrien began to understand that the future he once imagined might have been incomplete all along. The balcony doors opened softly as Adrien Whitmore and Nia stepped back into the ballroom, the warmth of the room immediately replacing the cool night air that had surrounded them outside. The orchestra had shifted to a livelier melody now, and the energy inside the room felt slightly brighter than before. Conversations flowed easily between tables while waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of drinks and desserts. From across the room, Micah noticed them returning and lifted his head from the robot display he had been studying. His eyes brightened when he saw his mother walking toward him, and he immediately stepped away from the small exhibit and returned to the table with quick but careful steps. Adrien watched the boy's movement with quiet attention. Even the way Micah walked carried a certain thoughtful balance, as if he measured each step before taking it. It was a detail Adrien had begun noticing again and again throughout the evening. Nia reached the table first and rested a gentle hand on Micah's shoulder. "Did you like the robot?" she asked softly. Micah nodded enthusiastically. "It has sensors in the wheels so it can avoid obstacles," he explained. "I asked the volunteer how it works." Adrien stood a few feet away listening to the conversation. The boy's explanation was clear and organized, the kind of description someone gave when they truly understood what they were talking about. Adrien had spent years working with brilliant engineers who struggled to explain their ideas in simple terms. Yet here was a 7-year-old doing exactly that without effort. "That is impressive," Adrien said quietly. Micah looked up again, slightly surprised that Adrien was still nearby. "Do you build robots like that?" the boy asked. Adrien walked closer to the table again. "Some of our teams design machines that help factories and hospitals," he said. "But they all begin with the same ideas you are learning now." Micah considered that statement with the serious expression Adrien had come to recognize during the evening. "So small ideas can become big inventions later," he said thoughtfully. Adrien smiled faintly. "That is exactly how most inventions begin." Nia watched the exchange silently for a moment before pulling out the chair beside Micah and sitting down. The subtle gesture signaled that the evening was moving toward its later stages. Guests across the ballroom had begun gathering near the stage again, where the host was preparing to announce the final presentation of the night. Adrien glanced toward the stage and then back at the table. "They will start the closing program soon," he said quietly. Nia nodded. "We will probably leave after that." Adrien felt the words settle heavily in his chest. The thought of them leaving the ballroom created a sudden awareness that this unexpected reunion might end as quietly as it had begun. 7 years of absence had suddenly narrowed into a single evening, and the possibility of losing contact again felt strangely difficult to accept. Micah, however, seemed unaware of the deeper tension unfolding around him. He had picked up the event brochure again and was examining a diagram showing different renewable energy projects supported by the Foundation. "Look," he said to Nia while pointing to the page. "This one shows a wind turbine that powers an entire school." Nia leaned closer to read the description. "That means the school can generate its own electricity," she explained. Micah's eyes widened slightly with fascination. "So the wind helps them learn." Adrien listened to the exchange with quiet interest. The boy's way of connecting ideas carried the same kind of creative thinking Adrien valued inside his company's research teams. But here it appeared naturally, untrained and curious. The host's voice suddenly rose through the speakers near the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our final presentation in just a moment. Please take your seats." Guests across the ballroom began returning to their tables. The lights dimmed slightly while the large screen behind the stage illuminated with images of the Foundation's programs. Adrien remained standing beside the table for another moment before pulling out a chair across from Micah and sitting down. It was the first time he had taken a seat with them since the evening began. Nia noticed the small decision but did not comment. The room gradually quieted as the presentation started. Images of classrooms, science workshops, and community learning centers appeared on the large screen, while a narrator described the programs supported by the event. Micah watched the screen attentively, his eyes following each image with deep focus. Adrien found himself watching the boy instead of the presentation. Every reaction Micah had to the images revealed another small piece of his personality. When the screen showed a group of students building a solar panel project, Micah leaned forward slightly in his chair. When a teacher explained how coding helped children design simple machines, the boy's expression brightened with recognition. Adrien realized that the world being presented on the stage represented the kind of future he had always hoped technology could create. Yet, the most meaningful example of that future might be sitting right across from him. Halfway through the presentation, Micah turned slightly toward Adrien again. "Do you think kids like them could work at your company someday?" he asked quietly. Adrien answered without hesitation. "If they continue asking questions the way you do, I believe they could." Micah seemed satisfied with that answer and returned his attention to the screen. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes before the host returned to the stage for closing remarks. Applause filled the ballroom once again while guests began standing and gathering their belongings. Adrien remained seated for a moment longer, aware that the evening was reaching its final minutes. Nia gently placed a hand on Micah's shoulder. "Time to go," she said softly. The boy nodded and slid carefully out of his chair. Adrien stood as well. For a moment, the three of them faced each other in the soft glow of the chandeliers while the crowd moved around them toward the exits. Adrien looked at Micah one more time, committing the boy's curious expression to memory. "It was good meeting you tonight," Adrien said. Micah smiled politely. "You too." Then the boy turned toward the ballroom doors with his mother. Adrien watched them begin walking across the room, their figures gradually moving through the crowd toward the exit. And as he stood there beneath the fading music of the orchestra, Adrien Whitmore realized that the most important part of his life might have just walked toward the door without him. Adrien Whitmore stood still for a moment after Nia and Micah began walking toward the ballroom exit, the quiet movement of the crowd flowing around him like a current he had not yet decided to follow. The orchestra had stopped playing and soft recorded music now filled the room while guests gathered their coats and exchanged final conversations before leaving the event. The chandeliers above reflected warm gold light across the polished floor, and for the first time since the evening began, Adrien felt a strange tension between the life he had built and the life that had quietly revealed itself tonight. Across the room, he could still see Nia guiding Micah carefully through the crowd. The boy walked beside her with the calm attentiveness Adrien had noticed earlier, occasionally glancing around the ballroom with quiet curiosity as if committing the memory of the place to his mind. Adrien realized that if he allowed them to leave now, the moment might close again just as completely as it had 8 years ago. The thought moved through him with sudden clarity. Adrien stepped away from the table and began walking toward the exit. His pace was controlled but purposeful, weaving through small groups of guests who were still engaged in polite conversations. A few people greeted him as he passed, offering compliments about his speech or asking brief questions about upcoming projects. But Adrien responded with quick polite acknowledgments without stopping. His focus remained fixed on the two figures approaching the tall glass doors at the far side of the ballroom. Nia had just reached the coat check area when Adrien finally caught up to them. "Nia," he said quietly. She turned slightly, surprised but not startled, while Micah paused beside her and looked up with mild curiosity. For a moment the three of them stood near the doorway where cool night air drifted in every time the door opened for departing guests. Adrien took a breath before speaking again. "I do not want this to end the way it did before." Nia studied him carefully, her expression thoughtful but guarded. "The evening is ending whether we want it to or not," she replied calmly. Adrien nodded once. "I know, but the conversation should not end here." Micah looked between them again, sensing that something serious was being discussed even if he did not fully understand the details. "Mom," he said quietly, "are we leaving now?" Nia rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. "In a minute," she answered softly. Adrien glanced down at the boy and then back at Nia. "He deserves honesty," Adrien said carefully. Nia did not respond immediately. The lobby beyond the ballroom doors glowed with soft white lighting, while hotel staff moved quietly between guests collecting their belongings. Finally she spoke. Honesty is not something you introduce suddenly into a child's life without preparing him for it. Adrien absorbed the words slowly. And when will he be ready? Nia looked at Micah for a moment before answering. When the truth helps him grow instead of confusing him. Adrien nodded again, understanding the care behind her reasoning. Yet the quiet certainty inside him had already begun forming. Then I would like the chance to be part of that future, he said. Nia's eyes searched his face, measuring the sincerity behind the statement. You built your life without looking back, she said quietly. Adrien did not deny it. Yes, he replied. But tonight showed me that the past never disappeared the way I believed. Micah tugged gently at Nia's sleeve again. Mom, he asked softly, are you and Mr. Whitmore friends? The question hung briefly in the air. Nia knelt slightly, so she was level with him. We knew each other a long time ago, she said. Micah considered that explanation thoughtfully. Like when you were younger? Nia nodded. Yes. The boy seemed satisfied with the answer and looked back toward the lobby where other families were leaving the event. Adrien watched the interaction quietly, feeling the growing awareness that every moment of Micah's life had been shaped by Nia's careful guidance. The boy's patience, curiosity, and kindness were reflections of the stability she had built around him. Adrien realized that stepping into that world required more than a simple declaration of responsibility. It required trust. I am not asking to change his life overnight, Adrien said gently. I am asking for the opportunity to earn a place in it. Nia studied him again. For years, she had believed Adrien Whitmore would remain exactly the man he was when they separated, driven entirely by ambition and the demands of his empire. Yet tonight she had watched him kneel beside a curious child to discuss solar-powered cars and listen patiently to questions about robots. That was not the man she remembered leaving their apartment 8 years earlier. Trust takes time, she said quietly. Adrien nodded without hesitation. Then I am prepared to give it time. Micah suddenly stepped closer to Adrien, studying him with open curiosity again. Are you going to come to the science fair next month? He asked. Adrien blinked slightly at the unexpected question. Your science fair? Micah nodded enthusiastically. Our class is building wind turbines that can light up small houses. Adrien felt a faint smile appear before he could stop it. That sounds like something I would like to see. Micah looked pleased with the answer and turned back toward Nia. See, he said confidently. I told you he likes inventions. Nia exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. She stood again and looked at Adrien. We will talk, she said finally. Adrien understood the meaning behind the words. It was not a promise of immediate change, but it was not a refusal either. It was the beginning of something uncertain but possible. Nia took Micah's hand and began guiding him toward the lobby exit. This time Adrien did not stop them. Instead, he watched quietly as they walked through the glass doors and stepped into the cool New York night. And as the doors closed softly behind them, Adrien Whitmore realized that for the first time in many years the future ahead of him no longer looked like a carefully planned strategy. It looked like a question waiting to be answered. The glass doors of the hotel closed quietly behind Nia and Micah as they stepped onto the sidewalk outside the Hudson Meridian, where the night air of New York carried the distant hum of traffic and the soft glow of streetlights reflecting against the pavement. Adrien Whitmore remained standing inside the lobby for several seconds after they disappeared from view, his reflection faintly visible in the polished marble floor beneath him. Guests from the gala continued passing by with quiet conversations and gentle laughter, but Adrien felt strangely removed from the familiar rhythm of the evening. For years his life had been guided by clear decisions and measurable outcomes. Every partnership, every product launch, every strategic move had followed a structure that could be analyzed and predicted. Yet the conversation that had just taken place at the ballroom door had introduced a kind of uncertainty he had never allowed into his carefully constructed world. Adrien finally turned and walked slowly toward the hotel entrance. When the doorman opened the glass doors for him, the cool night air brushed across his face again, carrying the distant sound of car horns and the soft rush of the East River several blocks away. New York at night had always energized him. It was the city where ambition thrived and where people built futures from nothing but determination. Tonight, however, the city felt different. Adrien stepped onto the sidewalk and looked down the street. A black sedan waited near the curb, the same car his driver had arranged earlier in the evening. But Adrien did not move toward it yet. Instead, he looked down the avenue where Nia and Micah had walked moments before. The street was busy with taxis, ride-shares, and pedestrians moving through the cool evening air. Somewhere among them, a 7-year-old boy with curious eyes and a thoughtful mind was beginning the quiet routine of heading home after a long evening. Adrien felt the realization settle deeper into his thoughts. 7 years of bedtime stories. 7 years of questions about how the world worked. 7 years of discoveries that had shaped the person Micah was becoming. All of it had happened without Adrien Whitmore knowing that his own child existed. The thought did not arrive with anger or regret the way Adrien expected. Instead, it arrived with a quiet sense of responsibility that felt both unfamiliar and undeniable. Adrien finally stepped toward the waiting car, but instead of entering immediately, he paused beside the open door and looked back toward the glowing entrance of the hotel. Inside, the gala continued winding down as staff members cleared tables and guests gathered their belongings. The entire evening had begun as another routine appearance in the life of a technology executive whose schedule rarely allowed time for reflection. Yet tonight had shifted something far deeper than any business deal ever had. Adrien closed the car door without getting inside. "Sir?" the driver asked from behind the wheel. Adrien leaned slightly toward the open window. "I will walk for a while," he said calmly. The driver nodded respectfully and closed the door again while Adrien began moving slowly down the sidewalk. The city lights stretched endlessly along the avenue, reflecting off the windows of tall buildings while the cool wind carried the scent of the river through the streets. Adrien walked without a clear destination, allowing his thoughts to move freely for the first time in years. The memories of his conversation with Nia returned one by one. Her calm explanation, the quiet certainty in her voice when she spoke about protecting Micah's future. Adrien had always respected Nia's strength, but tonight he understood it in a deeper way. She had built an entire life around raising their son, while Adrien built a company that dominated an industry. Neither of them had known the full story of the other's path until this evening. Adrien stopped at the corner of the street and looked across the river where the lights of Brooklyn shimmered against the dark water. For the first time since the moment he saw Micah in the ballroom, Adrien allowed himself to imagine what the future might look like if he followed through on the promise he had made at the door. It would not be simple. His life moved at a pace that rarely allowed room for anything unexpected. Whitmore dynamics demanded constant attention, and the public nature of his position meant every personal decision would eventually attract scrutiny. But none of those concerns felt as important now as the quiet image of a boy studying a small robot with careful curiosity. Adrien resumed walking. The city streets felt strangely calm as the night deepened and the rush of evening traffic slowly faded. Somewhere across the river, a ferry horn echoed softly through the darkness. Adrien Whitmore had built his life on the belief that the future belonged to those who planned it carefully. Tonight, he understood that some of the most important moments arrived without warning. They appeared quietly in the form of a question asked by a curious child, or in the calm voice of a woman who had already learned how to move forward without him. As Adrien continued down the sidewalk beneath the glow of the streetlights, he realized something that would have seemed impossible only hours earlier. The empire he had spent years building might not be the most important legacy he left behind. For the first time in a long while, Adrien Whitmore was not thinking about the next technology breakthrough or the next corporate expansion. He was thinking about a science fair, a small wind turbine project, and a boy who believed that the wind could help a school learn. And somewhere in the quiet movement of the city around him, Adrien began to understand that the future he had once imagined might only now be beginning to take its true shape. The night continued to deepen over New York as Adrien Whitmore walked along the quiet stretch of sidewalk beside the river, the steady rhythm of his footsteps blending with the distant hum of the city. The wind carried a faint chill now, brushing gently against his coat, while the reflections of skyscraper lights shimmered across the dark surface of the water. For years, Adrien had walked these streets with a mind constantly occupied by numbers, strategies, and deadlines. Every step had been part of a routine that reinforced the life he had chosen. But tonight his thoughts moved differently. The images that returned again and again were not financial projections or corporate expansions. They were small moments from the evening that refused to leave his mind. Micah studying the robot display with careful concentration. Micah explaining how a solar car traveled 12 feet across a classroom floor. Micah asking simple questions about inventions with the quiet seriousness of a child who genuinely wanted to understand the world. Adrien slowed his pace near a park bench overlooking the river and stopped for a moment, resting his hands lightly against the cold metal railing. The city lights stretched endlessly before him, but his thoughts remained focused on something much smaller and far more personal. 7 years. That number still echoed through his mind like a clock marking time he had never known existed. 7 years of mornings when Micah woke up asking questions about how machines worked. 7 years of school days filled with curiosity and small discoveries. 7 years when Nia had quietly built a life that revolved around helping their son grow into the thoughtful child Adrien had met tonight. Adrien exhaled slowly, realizing that the weight in his chest was not simply regret. It was recognition. Recognition that the future he had built without looking back had never truly been complete. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket, interrupting the quiet moment. Adrien glanced down at the screen and saw a message from his chief operating officer asking about the meeting scheduled for early the next morning. Normally, Adrien would respond immediately, reviewing the details of the upcoming discussion and adjusting the agenda if necessary. Instead, he stared at the screen for a moment before typing a short reply confirming the meeting would proceed as planned. Then he placed the phone back in his pocket without another thought. The river breeze moved gently across the sidewalk as Adrien resumed walking. A few late-night joggers passed him on the path, while a couple stood near the railing watching the ferry lights drift slowly across the water. The city continued moving with its usual quiet determination, unaware that the most powerful technology executive in the room earlier that evening was now walking through the night, trying to understand a future he had never planned. Adrien eventually turned toward a quieter street where the traffic thinned and the sound of the river faded behind tall buildings. His thoughts returned to the final words. Nia had spoken at the hotel door. Trust takes time. Adrien understood the meaning behind those words more clearly now. Nia had spent 7 years building a stable world for Micah. A world defined by patience, curiosity, and quiet strength. Adrien could not simply step into that world as if nothing had changed. If he wanted to be part of his son's life, he would have to prove that his presence would add something valuable rather than disrupt the balance Nia had created. The realization did not discourage him. Instead, it clarified the path ahead in a way that felt strangely familiar. Adrien Whitmore had spent his entire career earning trust from people who once doubted him. Investors had questioned his ideas in the early days of Whitmore Dynamics. Engineers had challenged his expectations during difficult development cycles. Competitors had dismissed his ambitions until the company's success proved them wrong. Trust had always been something Adrien understood how to build step by step. But this time the stakes were different. This time the outcome was not measured in market share or corporate growth. It was measured in whether a young boy with curious eyes would one day look at him not as a stranger, but as someone worth knowing. Adrien reached an intersection where the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. He stopped briefly and looked back toward the direction of the hotel. Somewhere beyond those buildings, Nia and Micah were already home, returning to the quiet routine that defined their evenings. Perhaps Micah was describing the robot display again, or asking another question about how wind turbines worked. Perhaps Nia was listening patiently the way she always had when someone needed to understand the world more clearly. Adrien smiled faintly at the thought. The image carried a warmth he had not expected to feel tonight. For years, Adrien had believed that the most meaningful legacy he could leave behind was the technology his company created. Machines that helped hospitals operate more efficiently. Software that allowed engineers to solve problems faster than ever before. Innovations that changed the way people lived and worked across the world. But as he stood beneath the quiet glow of the streetlights, Adrien realized that legacy might mean something much simpler and much more human. It might mean showing up to a science fair where a 7-year-old boy proudly demonstrated a small wind turbine project. It might mean listening carefully to questions about how machines worked and encouraging a mind that already showed signs of remarkable curiosity. Adrien took another step forward and continued down the street with renewed clarity in his thoughts. The future ahead of him would not be easy to navigate. Balancing the demands of his company with the responsibility he had just discovered would require patience and humility in ways he had rarely practiced before. Yet for the first time since the evening began, Adrien felt something steady replacing the uncertainty that had followed him through the night. Because the path forward no longer felt like a question waiting to be answered. It felt like a promise he intended to keep. The following morning sunlight filtered gently through the tall windows of a quiet elementary school gymnasium on the Upper West Side, casting soft rectangles of light across rows of folding tables arranged carefully around the room. Colorful poster boards, small models, and handwritten diagrams filled the space with the eager energy of a school science fair. Parents moved slowly between the tables with cups of coffee in their hands while teachers greeted students who stood proudly beside their projects, explaining their ideas with the confidence that only curiosity can create. Near the center of the room, Micah Carter stood beside a small display table where a simple wind turbine model had been carefully assembled from lightweight plastic blades, a tiny generator, and a small wooden base. The model was connected to a miniature house made of cardboard, and when the turbine blades spun beneath the airflow of a small fan, a tiny light inside the cardboard house flickered to life. Micah watched the light with quiet satisfaction while adjusting the position of the fan slightly to improve the rotation of the blades. His teacher had explained that real engineers often improve their designs by making small adjustments, and Micah had taken that lesson very seriously. Across the room, Nia Carter stood near the entrance speaking softly with another parent while keeping a watchful eye on her son. The gymnasium buzzed with excitement as families moved from one project to another, listening to explanations about solar energy, water filtration systems, and simple coding programs designed by students who were discovering their own potential. Nia glanced toward Micah again, just as the gymnasium doors opened quietly behind her. Adrien Whitmore stepped inside, the early sunlight catching the edge of his dark coat as he paused near the entrance. For a brief moment, he simply observed the room in front of him. The setting was simple compared to the polished conference halls and corporate auditoriums he usually visited. Folding tables, handwritten labels, colorful markers, and curious young minds filled the space with a kind of energy Adrien had not experienced in years. Yet something about the room felt deeply meaningful. Adrien spotted Micah almost immediately. The boy stood beside his wind turbine model explaining something to a small group of classmates who had gathered to see how the blades powered the tiny light inside the cardboard house. Adrien walked slowly toward the table, careful not to interrupt the conversation already happening there. When the wind spins the blades, Micah was explaining carefully, the generator makes electricity that travels through the wires to the house. That is how the light turns on. One of the other students leaned closer to see the mechanism. What happens when there is no wind? Micah thought about the question for a moment before answering. Then we store energy in batteries, he said thoughtfully. That way the house still has power later. Adrien listened quietly from a few steps away. The clarity in Micah's explanation carried the same thoughtful curiosity Adrien had noticed the night of the gala. But here, surrounded by other children and simple materials, that curiosity seemed even more natural. Micah finally noticed the tall figure standing nearby and looked up. His eyes widened slightly with recognition. You came, he said with open surprise. Adrien smiled warmly. I said I would. Micah glanced quickly toward his mother, who was now walking closer with a calm expression on her face. Nia met Adrien's eyes for a moment before giving a small nod of acknowledgement. Adrien understood the gesture. Trust takes time. But today was one small step forward. Do you want to see how it works? Micah asked eagerly. Adrien stepped closer to the table. I would like that very much. Micah adjusted the small fan again so the airflow hit the turbine blades directly. The blades began to spin slowly at first, then faster, until the tiny light inside the cardboard house flickered on again. Adrien leaned slightly closer, studying the simple design with genuine interest. You designed this yourself? He asked. Micah nodded proudly. My teacher helped me connect the generator, but the idea was mine. Adrien looked at the spinning blades for a moment before speaking again. That is exactly how innovation begins, he said. Micah tilted his head slightly. With a small idea? Adrien nodded. With a small idea that someone cares enough to explore. Micah smiled at that explanation and returned his attention to the turbine, adjusting the blades again as if imagining how the design could be improved further. Around them, the gymnasium continued buzzing with excitement as parents applauded other students and teachers encouraged their creativity. Adrienne looked around the room slowly, taking in the simple projects, the eager conversations, and the bright curiosity filling the space. For years, Adrien Whitmore had believed that the future of innovation belonged to powerful laboratories and billion-dollar research departments. Yet standing here now, watching a 7-year-old boy proudly demonstrate how wine could power a tiny house, Adrien understood something he had never fully appreciated before. The future did not begin inside corporations. It began in places like this, where curiosity met encouragement and small ideas were given room to grow. Nia stepped closer beside him, her voice quiet but steady. He has been waiting all morning to show you. Adrien glanced toward her with a faint smile. Then I am glad I arrived on time. Micah looked up again, his eyes bright with excitement as the tiny turbine continued spinning under the fan. Adrien Whitmore had spent years building machines designed to change the world. But in that quiet school gymnasium, watching the proud focus on his son's face as the small light inside the cardboard house flickered on and off, Adrien realized that the most important future he would ever help build was standing right in front of him.